The HOA president called me a troublemaker. The state called her a criminal. They shoved my wife down our porch steps over a garden trellis, not knowing I was a retired Navy SEAL who'd seen real war. I only wanted peace, but the HOA turned my home into a battlefield. When they started staging traps, I started recording. They thought I was just another homeowner. They didn't know they'd just woken a man who fights with proof, not fists. The wind off Pine Creek moved slow and cool, a low voice over the lake. Dawn was a thin silver line behind the timber, and the porch smelled of cedar, damp soil, and the small, sharp green of the herbs Sarah tended every morning. Jake watched her from the kitchen window, the trellis he'd built leaning against the rail like a promise half fulfilled. He hadn't expected trouble, only the soft rhythms of retirement. The creak of boards, the neighbor's dog barking, the steady breath of water over rock. They came in a black SUV with faded HOA letters and an air of rehearsed certainty. 3 men stepped onto the porch like they owned the wood. One wore a polo with the association mark. Another had sleeves rolled and a phone ready, as if framing the moment for some unseen court. The clipboard man read as if the bylaws were scripture. "Inspection," he announced, the word flat as weather. "Unauthorized structure. Remove it in 48 hours. Sarah straightened, her fingers stained with soil, hair tucked back from the line of her cheek where the light had silvered it. She spoke slowly, in a voice that had steered frightened patients through the worst nights in an ER. "We didn't know we needed approval. We can file retroactively," the man interrupted, a brusque reach past her to move a pot. His hand brushed Sarah's shoulder in the way of people used to handling things more than people. It was small and thoughtless. It should have meant nothing. Instead, the porch lip caught her shoe, and she pitched forward. The dull thud when she hit cedar sounded wrong and intimate. She reached for the step, fingers clutching the grain. A hot line of pain drew across her face as she shielded her shoulder. Jake was across the room before the full name attached to the motion had settled. Old reactions are cataloged in a body. Observe, assess, act. He watched the clipboard man's smirk, the cameraman's steady palm, the way the other 2 framed authority as performance. His training had taught him lots of ways to answer aggression, but he no longer moved by training alone. He had a life carved out of quieter things now. Dovetails, planed finishes, the slow apprenticeship of wood and time. He could have struck the clipboard man. The reflex existed, clean and bright. But another set of tools lived in him now. Patience, discipline, and a willingness to let paper do what fists might only complicate. He knelt beside Sarah, touched gentle where hands needed to be. "Can you move it?" he asked, voice even. She drew a tight breath, a stubbornness in her that had seen midnight wards and trauma bays. "My shoulder," she said. The color left her face in a slow tide. The man with the violation notice pushed the paper between Jake's fingers and stepped back as if his role were finished. 48 hours, he said, or fines will apply. No one in the rank of men at his doorstep offered aid. They had a ritual to perform, and they performed it. The SUV idled away, authority receding into the road's dust. Jake steadied Sarah at the kitchen table and reached for the first aid kit he kept for the honest accidents of farm life. He wrapped the joint with steady hands learned in other rooms where pain was a thing to be treated, not weaponized. He set the violation on the table and took out his phone. He photographed the trellis, the exact scuff on the second step, the spot where Sarah had fallen in the morning light. Each image he labeled with a time, a short note. He typed a terse message to Ernest Walker next door and to Rebecca at the clinic. He posted a measured line on the community board. "Incident this morning. Witnesses appreciated. Please note details." The small ripples reached outward. He did not feel the thunder of fury. He felt the cool river of resolve that comes from the knowledge of process. There is a kind of weapon that is not heavy and blunt, but slow and deadening. Documentation. Paper and time could cut a petty empire of bylaws apart if you were willing to be persistent. The trellis would remain. That would be the visible thing the enforcers wanted to erase. Jake planned to make the invisible things visible. Names, times, witness statements, pictures, and the ledger of who profited from enforcement. Outside the window, the lake watched, patient as an old juror. Ernest's dog gave 2 soft barks and settled. A pickup coughed down the way, the sound folding into morning. Jake photographed the violation once more, then another time for good measure. He sealed the images into a folder and wrote a clean label across the tab. Incident. Morrison. 0645. He took the binder down from the shelf as if choosing a trusted tool, the same motion he used when fitting a dovetail to its mate. The work of undoing a rule-made kingdom rarely needed the flourish of violence. It needed attention repeated until the rotten parts were exposed. He set a cup of hot tea beside Sarah and watched the steam blur the sunlight. She smiled through the ache with a small, brave light. He told her his plan as simple fact, not threat. Photograph, collect witness statements, study the bylaws, talk to the county clerk if they stonewalled, and take it into the light. He would be methodical. He would be patient. He would not take the easy temptation of a quick strike. When the enforcers left, Bethany Whitfield continued her morning ritual somewhere down the road. Coffee, a tidy garden, a list of minor infractions that fed a hunger for order. She had not yet read a name that would in time be written in another man's neat hand. For now she wore the small power of enforcement as if it defined the moral arc of a place. For now the trellis and the herb pots and the folded notice were the only pieces of a story that would soon be larger. Jake photographed the grain of the wood, the nick on the step, the smear of earth where Sarah's hand had pressed into the cedar. He wrote the name of the HOA clipboard man in full and noted the number on the HOA vehicle. He walked the short lane to Ernest Walker's porch and laid the binder in the old man's palm. Ernest nodded in a way that was not surprised. The old man had seen small tyrannies before and knew how they fed. "You'll want more than me," Ernest said in a dry voice. "They don't bow at the first sound. They wait for everyone else to be quiet." Jake closed the gate with the soft click of temperate metal. He did not feel victorious. He felt the correct coolness of a man beginning a necessary work. He picked up his phone and typed into the neighbor group again, more precise this time, asking for timestamps and whether anyone had seen the truck's license. He made a note to call the clinic and ask for Sarah's intake record. He would collect statements and he would store them. He placed the violation notice back into the folder and then said the words he wanted to live by. "I won't hit them," he told Sarah, the promise gentle. "I'll erase their power." It was not a shout. It was an oath that required time and patience, the sort of thing that grew with record cards and witness lines and the slow accumulation of facts. The lake kept its cool. The trellis leaned into the breeze. The work had begun. By the next morning, the violation notice had multiplied like weeds after rain. 4 new envelopes waited in the mailbox, each stamped "Urgent, HOA compliance violation." Jake stood in the gravel drive, the morning sun glinting off the foil ink, and opened them one by one. Mailbox paint not to HOA specification, fence height exceeding approved limits, unauthorized exterior ornamentation, trellis, improper placement of refuse container. It was almost elegant in its pettiness, a tactical barrage of bureaucracy designed to exhaust before it punished. The fines totaled over $800. Each violation came with a deadline shorter than a grocery list. Inside, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, arm in a soft sling, steam rising from her untouched tea. "You'd think they'd send flowers before firing the first salvo," she said, voice dry. Jake smiled faintly, but his jaw stayed tight. "Paper bullets," he said. "Cheaper than courage." Outside, the sound of a lawnmower hummed like distant static. Across the cul-de-sac, Bethany Whitfield's porch glowed white in the noon sun. The self-appointed queen of Pine Creek Estates stood beside her hydrangeas, wearing her usual uniform, cream sweater, pearls, clipboard in hand. She watched the street the way a hawk watched a field mouse, calmly, waiting for movement. Jake stepped off his porch and crossed the road. Her perfume reached him before her smile did. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said. "I trust you've received our notices?" He nodded, stopping 3 feet short of her fence line. "I have. Quite the stack. Must have killed half a tree." "Rules maintain harmony," she replied sweetly. "And harmony maintains property value. You of all people should appreciate structure." Jake's voice stayed level. "I spent 25 years following rules that actually mattered. These," he gestured with the envelopes, "read more like a power trip." Bethany's smile stiffened, but her tone stayed light. "Perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you, Mr. Morrison. Some residents find the expectations rigorous." He watched her eyes as she spoke, the glint of satisfaction when she saw frustration flicker across his face. But what she mistook for irritation was calculation. He was learning her rhythm, her confidence. Every word she spoke revealed the blueprint of her control. When he turned back toward his house, the sunlight caught on the brass number fixed to his mailbox. A number now, apparently, the wrong shade of bronze. He took a slow breath, memorizing the color in case it became evidence later. That evening, the air smelled of rain and cut grass. Jake sat at the kitchen table with his old service notebook open. Across its pages, in neat block letters, he began to build his operation. Date, incident, witness, photo. He listed each violation with timestamps, took pictures of every alleged infraction, then cross-referenced the HOA bylaws he'd downloaded from the county clerk's site. The bylaws were written like a maze, dense, circular, self-contradictory. But in every maze there was a pattern, and Jake had spent half his life finding patterns hidden in chaos. At 9 p.m., a knock sounded at the door. Ernest Walker, the former sheriff, stood outside with a thermos and the look of a man who'd seen trouble coming a mile away. "Heard you got yourself noticed," Ernest said, stepping inside. "That woman's been running this place like a fiefdom since her husband's firm started building here." Jake poured him a cup of coffee. "You ever see them this aggressive before?" Ernest chuckled without humor. "They pick targets, quiet folks usually, people who pay fines instead of asking questions. You're different. They'll push harder." "Then I'll push quieter," Jake said. Before he left, Ernest dropped a folded paper on the table, a photocopy of a county zoning map. "Old habit," he said. "That land behind Bethany's house, filed under her sister's name. Funny thing for a community president preaching transparency." When the door shut behind him, Jake unfolded the map. The plot lines told a story. Undeclared easements, unexplained transfers. It wasn't just about trellises and mailboxes. Something was buried under the manicured lawns and polished bylaws. Sarah's voice drifted from the hallway, soft but firm. "Don't let them pull you back into that old headspace." Jake looked up, eyes steady. "This isn't combat," he said quietly. "It's reconnaissance." Outside, thunder rolled over the ridge. He could see Bethany's lights still burning across the street, her silhouette pacing the window like a general surveying her domain. Jake opened a new page in his notebook and wrote one line across the top. Operation Pine Creek. Objective, exposure. He placed the pen neatly on the paper, turned off the lamp, and watched the storm roll in. What kind of HOA needs this much silence around its books? By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Pine Creek washed clean but restless. The gravel road shimmered with puddles that mirrored the sky, and Jake could smell the wet pine drifting through the open window. Sarah slept late. Painkillers made her dreams heavy. He poured coffee, black and still too hot, and looked out toward the lake where mist was peeling off the surface like smoke. The first knock came soft, polite, hesitant. Ernest Walker stood there again, hat in hand, his weathered raincoat dripping onto the porch boards. "Heard the HOA's dogs were sniffing around your fence line last night," he said, stepping inside before Jake could answer. "Flashlights, 2 of them. Took a few photos, probably of the trellis." Jake didn't react. He walked to the table, opened his binder, and scribbled the date. Unauthorized nighttime inspection. Ernest gave a dry chuckle. "You keep writing long enough, you'll need your own filing cabinet." "That's the plan," Jake said. They sat, the quiet filled with the creak of wood and the hum of the old fridge. The retired sheriff studied him. "You planning to fight him in court?" Jake's answer came slow. "I'm planning to fight them where they don't expect it. Facts, not fists." Ernest nodded approvingly. "Then you'll want to talk to Rebecca." "Who's Rebecca?" "My niece," Ernest said. "She's a nurse down at the county hospital. Works with your wife sometimes. Knows folks who've been bullied out of here. Families who just packed up and left. Same story. Fines, legal letters, surprise inspections. Some of them swore Bethany had something to do with their homes getting reclassified for back taxes." Jake frowned. "Reclassified how?" "Turns out," Ernest said, leaning back, "the HOA's been cozy with the county assessor's office. File a few complaints, drop a few valuations, people sell cheap, and guess who ends up with the properties? Bethany's sister, woman named Karen Whitfield. She's been buying them through a shell LLC." Jake's fingers tightened on the coffee mug. Outside, a blue jay called from the fence line. "So that's what she's protecting," he murmured. "A land grab, hidden under bylaws." Ernest nodded once, then pulled a folded note from his pocket. "Rebecca'll meet you at the clinic cafe tomorrow, noon. She'll bring someone." That someone turned out to be a tall woman in a charcoal blazer with rain still clinging to her hair. Sarah Coleman, attorney. She moved with quiet precision, like someone accustomed to walking the edge of arguments. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm of a person who knew the law could be sharper than any blade. "I've looked at your HOA's filings," she said, flipping through her tablet. "Their 2022 financial disclosure is missing 2 required statements. Landscaping expenditures, $24,000 unaccounted for. Consulting fees, $50,000 paid to a non-existent vendor called Pine Creek Advisory." Jake felt the faint tremor of adrenaline. "So they're laundering money through fake invoices." "Looks that way," she said. "But proving it takes time. You'll need internal documents, meeting minutes, bank transfers, board approvals. That means a resident request under the state HOA transparency statute. They have to comply within 10 business days." He studied her across the small cafe table. "If they don't?" "Then we file a complaint with the Attorney General's office," Sarah replied, sipping her coffee. "But fair warning, they'll try to intimidate you before it gets that far." Jake smiled without humor. They already started. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the Johnsons' place next door. Mike was out back repairing a fence post while his wife, Rebecca, watered tomato plants near the porch. "We heard about Sarah," she said softly, touching her shoulder in sympathy. "You two don't deserve this." Jake shrugged. "I've seen worse fights. Just not in a neighborhood with picket fences." Mike leaned on his hammer. "Be careful, Jake. They don't like being questioned. Last time I raised an issue about dues increases, I found my mailbox smashed the next morning." "Any chance you still have those meeting notes from that month?" Jake asked. Mike hesitated, then went inside and returned with a folder, dusty but organized. "I don't want trouble," he said, "but maybe it's time someone gave it to them." That night, Jake spread the pages across the dining table. Receipts, budgets, minutes typed in stiff corporate tone. He traced the signatures: Bethany's looping flourish, Doug Peterson's neat accountant's script. He noticed something odd: payments to consultants dated 2 weeks before board approval. That was illegal under their own bylaws. He looked up when Sarah walked in, still in her sling, but smiling faintly. "You're building a case, Joe," she said. "More like an ark," he replied. "The flood's coming." Outside, the moon slid between clouds, casting silver bars across the yard. The neighborhood seemed too quiet, as if the air itself were holding its breath. From somewhere down the hill came the faint hum of a car engine idling too long. Jake stood by the window, lights off, and saw it. A dark SUV parked near the corner, headlights off, just sitting, watching. He didn't move, didn't reach for anything but his camera. One flash, quick, silent through the curtain. The SUV rolled away moments later. He printed the photo, date and time stamped, and slipped it into the binder beneath the heading: "Suspicious vehicle. Possible surveillance." Then he looked out across the lake one more time, at the reflection of his trellis swaying gently in the wind. "We build pressure slow," he murmured to himself, repeating the line that had become his creed. In the silence that followed, even the frogs stopped singing. The following Tuesday, Jake stood outside the Pine Creek Community Clubhouse, watching a row of sedans glitter under the noon sun. The building itself was new, too new, its white columns and fake stone facade smelling faintly of fresh paint and money. The air was thick with trimmed grass and faint chlorine from the decorative fountain that burbled beside the steps. Sarah had wanted to come, but her shoulder wasn't ready, so it was just Jake, his binder tucked beneath one arm like a soldier's field manual. The last time he'd walked into a room like this, he'd been wearing body armor. Now it was just denim, work boots, and a calm resolve sharper than any blade. Inside, the air conditioning hummed over the scent of polish and lemon oil. A long table dominated the room, flanked by folding chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in for real discussion. Behind it sat 5 board members. At the center, Bethany Whitfield. Her hair was perfect, her pearl earrings steady as moons. To her right was Doug Peterson, the HOA treasurer, a thin man whose fingers seemed to twitch every time Bethany moved. "Mr. Morrison?" Bethany said, voice dripping honey. "You requested this meeting?" Jake nodded once. "I did. I'd like to resolve these citations before you send any more." Bethany's smile barely shifted. "Well, I'm sure we can clarify expectations. Let's begin." She opened a leather folder filled with neatly tabbed documents, each labeled like ammunition. Violation 1. Unapproved structure. Violation 2. Unsanctioned vegetation. Violation 3. Jake interrupted, his tone steady but cutting through her words like a wire. "Before we list charges, I'd like to address procedure. Your bylaws require written notice and verification before fines. These," he lifted the stack of letters, "don't show verification signatures, only your initials." Bethany blinked. Doug coughed softly. He continued, "And your so-called unapproved structure is a garden trellis. Page 37, Section 8C says structures under 6 feet are exempt from committee review." Bethany shifted in her chair, her smile tightening at the edges. "You seem unusually familiar with our regulations." "I read what you sent," Jake said, "and everything you didn't." Doug leaned toward Bethany, whispering something she didn't like. She snapped her folder shut. "Mr. Morrison, we have limited time. Either comply or face continued fines." Jake's gaze didn't waver. "I have photos of 3 other properties with unapproved structures, one in your own yard. None of them were fined." The room went still. The other board members looked down at their papers, pretending not to hear. Jake opened his binder, sliding a photo across the table. Bethany's backyard, her gazebo shining white under morning sun. Selective enforcement, Jake said quietly. State law calls that illegal. Doug paled. Bethany's eyes flicked toward him, warning sharp as lightning. We're not here to discuss my property, she said finally. We're here about your violations. Jake leaned forward slightly. If your finances are as inconsistent as your enforcement, I'd say this board has bigger problems. Doug dropped his pen. Bethany's smile froze, her knuckles whitening against the tabletop. For a long second, no one breathed. Then she said, very softly, "This meeting is adjourned." Jake didn't move. Not yet. He reached into his binder again and set down a printed request, signed and dated. Under state law, I'm formally requesting access to the HOA's financial records and meeting minutes for the last 2 years. You have 10 business days to comply. Bethany's chair creaked as she stood. You'll regret this, she whispered, voice like silk over glass. Jake smiled faintly. I've regretted worse things. Outside, the sunlight hit him full in the face as he stepped into the parking lot. The heat felt good, real. Behind him, muffled voices rose, sharp and panicked. He knew the sound, command slipping away from those who'd abused it too long. That night, he told Sarah everything. She listened quietly, eyes steady. You're poking a nest, she said. They already stung first. He pulled out a small recorder from his pocket and set it on the table. Every word of that meeting's on here. They can't twist it now. She smiled faintly. You sound like the old you. Jake looked out the window toward the dark line of trees. The old me didn't have you. This time, it's not about survival. It's about correction. Later, as the crickets started up and lightning flashed over the ridge, he stepped outside for air. The neighborhood was quiet again, but not peaceful. Too many curtains shifted when he walked by. Too many engines started just after he passed. At the edge of his property, he paused by the trellis, the small structure that had started it all. Its vines trembled in the wind, the flowers catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. He ran a hand along the rough cedar, grounding himself. Headlights flickered down the road and stopped in front of his gate. For a moment, the engine idled, unmoving. Then the lights turned off. The car stayed there, silent. Jake didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply raised his phone, the camera flashing once. Evidence. By the time he reached the porch again, thunder rolled behind the hills and rain began to fall, hard, relentless, cleansing. He watched it sheet across the wood, washing away dust and old leaves. In that sound, he heard something like resolve taking shape. Inside, Sarah called softly, "Come in, Jake, it's late." He looked once more toward the dark street and the idling car that wasn't there anymore. "Yeah," he said under his breath, "but tomorrow's going to be louder." Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of Montana dawn that smells of rain and old pine. The lake was smooth again, pretending peace. Jake moved through the kitchen quietly, coffee steaming in one hand. His other tracing lines on the notebook spread open on the table. His handwriting, precise, military neat, filled page after page. Names, times, invoices, photographs, violations. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger burned quick and left nothing but ash. What filled him now was colder, steadier. He had no uniform, no orders, but the mission was clear. The HOA wasn't a government or a platoon. It was smaller, pettier, but the patterns of control were the same, and patterns Jake knew could be dismantled. By 8 o'clock, he was in the barn. The walls smelled of cedar and oil. The rafters caught the morning light like cathedral beams. The binder lay on the workbench beside his old tools. He'd cleared a section of the wall and tacked up a wide corkboard. On it, he pinned printed photos of Bethany, Doug, the enforcers, and the HOA emblem that showed up on every notice. He drew connecting lines in red twine, the same twine he used to measure timber lengths. He labeled each node: authority, finance, enforcement, legal cover. Then, in the center, he pinned one word: control. That was the heart of it. Every rule, every letter, every fine, all of it designed to keep people quiet, dependent, obedient. The barn door creaked open behind him. Sarah stood there, wrapped in his old flannel jacket, her arm still in the sling. "You building furniture or a war plan?" she asked softly. "Same thing," Jake said with a half smile. "Measure twice. Cut clean." She stepped closer, eyes scanning the board. "That's Donald Snipe, right? The one who pushed me?" "Yeah," he said, pinning a photo of Donald near the top. "He's the muscle. But look, his paycheck's coming from a private security firm registered under Doug Peterson's son. Follow the money, and you find the leash." Sarah traced one of the red lines with her free hand. "So what's next?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her. "We document everything. Every bylaw breach, every inconsistency. Then we hit them where it hurts: paperwork and exposure." Outside, the sound of a truck rumbled up the gravel road. Ernest Walker stepped down from his old Chevy, his silhouette framed in the doorway. "Brought you something," he said, lifting a box. Inside were 3 small trail cameras, the kind used for hunting elk. "Mount these around your property line," Ernest said. "They won't see 'em, but you'll see them." Jake nodded. "You think they'll come again?" "Already have," Ernest said, lighting a cigarette. "Saw Chad Wilson taking photos from his SUV last night. Claimed he was checking drainage." Jake wrote another note on the wall. Surveillance increased. That night, the first of the cameras blinked red in the darkness, silently recording. The footage from the next morning showed exactly what Ernest had warned about. Chad walking along the fence, camera in hand, taking pictures of everything, even their living room windows. Jake didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, he sent the stills to Sarah Coleman, the lawyer. "Proof of harassment," he wrote. "Pattern of intimidation. Request confirmation of legal boundaries." By the weekend, Jake had something new in place. The barn wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was an operations center. The whiteboard tracked HOA expenditures, the corkboard mapped connections, and his laptop housed every photo and document backed up twice. One drive hidden under the floorboards, one sent to Sarah Coleman's cloud account. When Sunday came, he resumed teaching his free self-defense classes by the lake. Parents gathered under the cottonwoods, kids running barefoot through the grass. The laughter felt like defiance. The HOA couldn't find that. Donald Snipe stood by his SUV across the road, watching. His posture was all swagger, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Jake met his gaze and gave a polite nod, nothing more. Later that afternoon, as the class dispersed, Jake found a folded piece of paper wedged under his windshield wiper. No name, no signature, just 6 words written in hurried block letters. "They're planning something. Tonight. Be ready." He looked around, but no one was there. The wind off the lake rustled the reeds. Distant thunder echoed from the hills. He unfolded the paper once more, studying the handwriting. Unsteady, rushed, maybe left-handed. "Donald?" He took it to the barn and pinned it under the word control. The string web shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Sarah joined him a moment later, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You think it's real?" she asked. "Maybe," Jake said. "Maybe it's the first crack in their armor." She set her cup down beside him. "Then let it crack." Outside, the lake was black glass under a sky full of restless clouds. The trellis near the porch swayed gently again. its vines whispering against the wood. Jake stood in the doorway of the barn, eyes scanning the empty road. "Quiet operations," he murmured, "until it isn't quiet anymore." Lightning flashed once across the ridge, throwing the outline of his house against the sky. In that brief light, the board behind him glowed, a map of evidence, of people who thought they ruled a town, and of one man quietly building their undoing. By midnight, the storm had passed, leaving a chill that crept under doors and into bone. Jake sat at his desk in the barn, the glow from his laptop illuminating rows of timestamps and images. The 3 trail cameras Ernest had given him had recorded more than he'd expected. Figures near the fence, flashlights sweeping through the grass, a silver SUV pulling up twice between midnight and 2 a.m. He zoomed in, frame by frame, until the headlights caught a face he knew. Chad Wilson, the HOA enforcer. Behind him, another man held a clipboard even in the dark. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. Jake stared at the number for a long moment. It had the ring of something deliberate. At dawn, Sarah came out to the barn, her hair tucked under a knit cap, steam rising from her mug. "You haven't slept," she said quietly. "Didn't plan to," Jake replied. "They came by again last night. Same car, same time. I think they're getting bold. Or desperate." He nodded, eyes still on the screen. Desperate men make mistakes. By afternoon, the HOA's harassment escalated. 2 new violation letters appeared, one citing improper driveway gravel, another accusing them of running an unlicensed business. The fines now totaled over $4,000. Sarah read them with a shaky laugh. "Do they just pull these out of a hat?" "They're trying to provoke us," Jake said. "They need me angry. They need a reason to call the cops again." He was right. That evening, as Sarah closed the curtains, a knock rattled the door, sharp, official. When Jake opened it, Officer Benson stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His cruiser idled behind him, lights off but engine humming. "Evening, Mr. Morrison," Benson said, his tone oily with forced politeness. "Got a complaint about possible code violations, unregistered business activity. Mind if I take a look around?" Jake leaned against the doorframe. "You got a warrant?" Benson smiled thinly. "Don't need one for a welfare check." "Then check your welfare somewhere else." For a heartbeat, the officer's smile faltered. Then he tipped his hat and stepped back into the rain. "Just doing my job." Jake shut the door. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his mind was running like a machine. He turned to Sarah. "They're building something. A setup. It's coming soon." That night, he checked the cameras again, recharged the batteries, and made sure every angle of the property was covered. The lake lay still beyond the tree line, catching faint starlight. The silence had weight. At 2:10 a.m., the sound of tires on gravel broke it. Jake's eyes opened before the headlights reached his window. He slipped on his boots, grabbed the small flashlight from the nightstand, and moved to the living room. Through the curtain, he saw the same SUV, same driver, Chad. Only this time, Officer Benson was with him. Jake's pulse slowed, his mind settling into that measured calm he'd carried through far worse nights. He picked up his phone, tapped record, and waited. The men walked around the truck, flashlights flicking across the property. Chad opened the driver's door and bent inside for a long moment. Benson kept watch, his hand resting casually on his belt. Then Chad straightened, shut the door, and gave a thumbs up. The SUV rolled away into the night. Jake exhaled slowly. Then he walked to the barn, pulled up the camera feed, and replayed it. 2:17 a.m., right on cue. He zoomed in, freezing the frame where Chad's hand disappeared under the truck seat. By sunrise, Benson was back, this time with a warrant. The sun glared hard off the badge pinned to his chest. Anonymous tip, he said smoothly. Claims there's contraband in your vehicle. Jake crossed his arms. That's a hell of a coincidence. Benson smirked. Just doing my job. He motioned to a deputy who popped open the driver's door. After a few seconds of searching, the deputy straightened, holding up a small plastic bag. Inside was a fine white powder. Benson's smirk widened. Well, well, care to explain this, Mr. Morrison? Jake's calm didn't waver. Sure, he said. But you might want to look at something first. He reached into his pocket and handed Benson a flash drive. That's last night's security footage. You'll want to skip to 2:17 a.m. The deputy hesitated, looking uncertain. Sir, maybe we should play it, Jake said firmly. 10 minutes later, the footage showed Benson and Chad on screen, the timestamp clear, the image unmistakable. Benson's smirk vanished. This doesn't prove... It proves enough, Jake said. And copies are already sent to my attorney, the county sheriff, and the local news desk. I'd suggest you step off my property before you add trespassing to the list. Benson backed away slowly, his face pale. You think you're clever, Morrison. You just made enemies. Jake watched them leave, the gravel crunching under their tires, the morning sun catching the dust like sparks. Sarah stepped out onto the porch beside him, her voice low. What happens now? Now, Jake said, we stop playing defense. He looked toward the lake, its surface gleaming cold and silver. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the space before the storm returns. But this time, he wasn't just waiting. In the barn, the evidence board glowed faintly under the light. At its center, under the word control, Jake pinned one more photo. Officer Benson's face, timestamp 2:17 a.m. Then, with the same calm he once used to plan missions halfway around the world, he wrote 3 words beneath it. Phase 2, exposure. The morning sun cut through the barn's slats in narrow golden bars. Dust drifted in the light, slow and deliberate, as if time itself had slowed to match Jake's heartbeat. He sat at the workbench, surrounded by evidence, printouts, video stills, and the kind of documentation that could bring down more than an HOA board. The previous night's footage was already safe. 2 copies, one in Sarah Coleman's hands and another mailed to the state attorney's office under a cover letter written with surgical precision. The trap had worked, but it wasn't enough. Corruption didn't die with embarrassment. It just found darker corners. Jake poured himself another cup of black coffee, the smell cutting through the barn's chill. He had one more move to make, one that required patience, not confrontation. By mid-morning, the knock came he'd been expecting. Ernest Walker stood in the doorway, holding a folded manila envelope. Got this from the county clerk, he said, handing it over. Financial filings from Pine Creek HOA. Cost me a favor and a slice of peach pie. Jake smiled. Appreciate it. Inside the envelope were 20 pages of numbers and signatures. Most of it looked normal at a glance. Dues collected, maintenance expenses, landscaping costs. But Jake's mind worked differently. He'd spent years reading reports where lives depended on a single miswritten digit. He caught it on page 13. A vendor listed as Silver Pine Consulting paid $47,500 for security assessments. The address matched a storage unit outside Helena registered under Doug Peterson's name. Another payment, $20,300, went to Whitfield Property Holdings, Bethany's sister's company. Jake set the pages aside and reached for his phone. Sarah Coleman, he said when she answered. I've got something you'll want to see. They met that afternoon at the coffee shop off Highway 12, the one with the chipped Formica tables and the smell of burnt espresso that no one could fix. She slid into the booth, blazer crisp despite the small-town dust. Jake spread the pages between them. Her eyes moved quickly. You've got direct transfers. That's embezzlement. And this vendor, Silverpine, doesn't exist in the state registry. Doug's using his kid as a front, Jake said. Money laundering through fake security contracts. It's why they were so desperate to keep me quiet. Sarah exhaled slowly. This is enough to start a state investigation. But if we go public too soon, they'll shred everything. Then we catch them doing it. That night, the plan took shape. Ernest installed one of the trail cameras across from the HOA office window, disguised in a mailbox post. Sarah set up a Dropbox folder for residents to anonymously submit their own violation notices and fines. Within hours, 25 files appeared. Stories of intimidation, selective enforcement, and vanishing HOA funds. One message stood out, unsigned, but typed in careful sentences. I used to handle bookkeeping for Bethany. There's another account. Off the books. Look for Pine Creek Trust. The next morning, Jake and Ernest went into town. The county bank sat on the corner of Main and Oak, its glass front reflecting the blue Montana sky. Inside, air conditioning hummed over the quiet rhythm of paperwork and distant printers. Jake approached the counter and smiled politely at the clerk. Morning, ma'am. I need to verify something for a tax discrepancy. The Pine Creek Trust. Do you have an account under that name? The clerk hesitated. I can't give details, sir. Privacy policy. Jake nodded. Of course, just one question. Does the account exist? She frowned, then softened, maybe recognizing something steady in his eyes. It does, she whispered. And it's flagged for irregular activity. That was all he needed. By the weekend, Sarah Coleman had enough evidence to file a formal complaint with the Montana Department of Consumer Affairs. Jake didn't celebrate. He'd learned long ago that victory rarely came with fanfare. It came quietly, through persistence. But the HOA noticed. On Monday morning, Jake woke to find his mailbox smashed and his driveway flooded with sprinkler runoff. A fresh violation notice lay on the porch, taped to the door in neat handwriting. Unauthorized modifications to property boundaries. Sarah read it and shook her head. They're panicking. Good, Jake said. Means we're close. At dusk, as he sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the horizon, he saw headlights turn slowly into Bethany's driveway. Doug Peterson stepped out, his posture uneasy. Through binoculars, Jake could see their silhouettes arguing, Bethany's hands slicing through the air, while Doug kept glancing toward Jake's house. A few hours later, Doug's car appeared again, this time stopping at the old clubhouse. The camera Ernest had installed caught him unlocking the door, pulling out boxes, and carrying them toward his trunk. Jake's phone buzzed. A message from Ernest. Got him. 2:43 a.m., full load of documents, copying footage now. By morning, the HOA office was empty. Clean desks, no files, no computers. But Jake didn't need them anymore. The footage told the story better than paper ever could. Sarah Coleman compiled everything into a single brief. Audio recordings, financial transfers, camera timestamps, and sworn statements from residents. When Jake met her outside the courthouse, the sky was the color of steel. She handed him a copy of the complaint, sealed and stamped. Once this is filed, there's no turning back, she said. Jake looked past her, toward the mountains that ringed the horizon like quiet witnesses. Good, he said. Let's see what happens when the truth hits sunlight. That night, he returned to his barn and pinned a new photo to the evidence wall. Bethany and Doug walking into the HOA meeting months ago, smiling like people who thought they'd never be caught. Under it, he wrote 4 words in black ink. The lie ends here. As the wind rose outside and the trellis rustled in the dark, Jake switched off the lamp. Tomorrow, the storm would begin again. Only this time, it wouldn't be weather. Morning came bright and brittle. The sky over Pine Creek was a clear, impossible blue, the kind that looks painted on before a reckoning. Jake's phone buzzed at 7:04 a.m. A message from Sarah Coleman. State investigators confirmed receipt. News crews heading your way. He set the phone down beside his coffee. The smell of cedar smoke drifted from the wood stove. Across the yard, the lake was still and glassy, pretending innocence. But he could feel the hum under it all, the collective breath of a town about to learn what its queen had been hiding. By 9, Pine Creek was no longer quiet. 2 black sedans rolled up to the HOA office, followed by a white SUV with the state seal on the side. Ernest was already there, leaning against his truck, arms crossed. "They're going through the place," he said when Jake joined him. "Locked file cabinets, hidden drives, the works." Jake nodded. "About time." Inside, the investigators moved methodically, their latex gloves whispering over paper and drawers. One of them, a young woman with a serious face, stepped out with a folder clutched to her chest. "We've got evidence of double bookkeeping," she said to her colleague. 2 ledgers, one for residents, one for someone else. "Bethany's sister," Jake said quietly. The woman looked at him, curious. "You knew?" "I guessed." By noon, news vans had arrived. Cameras pointed toward the HOA building, their cables snaking across the asphalt. The same neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now stood on lawns, watching, murmuring. Some had phones out, recording every second. Bethany arrived in her black Lexus, heels clicking like gunfire on concrete. She pushed through the crowd, face tight but composed. "This is harassment," she told the reporters. "A misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a disgruntled resident." Jake stepped forward then, the quiet in his voice cutting sharper than any accusation. "Funny thing about misunderstandings," he said. "They disappear when you hold them up to sunlight." The cameras turned. For a second, the air itself seemed to lean closer. Bethany's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something crack in them, a flicker of doubt, or fear, or both. "You think this makes you a hero, Mr. Morrison?" she said. "No," Jake answered. "Just a homeowner tired of paying for someone else's greed." Reporters swarmed, questions shouted, microphones thrust forward. Bethany turned and marched inside, but the damage was done. The story had already left her control. That afternoon, the sheriff's department, real deputies this time, not Benson's brand of loyalty, escorted Doug Peterson from his office. He looked smaller without his smugness, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. When asked for comment, he muttered something about accounting errors and bad advice. Jake stood by Ernest's truck, watching it all unfold. He didn't smile. Justice, he'd learned, rarely felt like celebration. It was more like relief mixed with exhaustion. Later that evening, Donald Snipe showed up at Jake's porch. He looked different. No uniform, no swagger, just a man carrying the weight of bad choices. "I didn't know how deep it went," Donald said, voice rough. "I just did what she told me." Jake studied him. "That's not an excuse." "I know," Donald said. "But I've got something that'll help you." He reached into his jacket and handed over a USB drive. "Security footage from the HOA office. You'll want to see it." Inside, under the lamplight, Jake plugged it in. The grainy video showed Bethany and Doug in a late-night meeting, piles of cash on the table. Doug's voice whispering, "Transfer it to the trust before Monday. The auditor's coming." Bethany's reply was cold. "If they find it, we'll say it was a clerical error. People believe what you repeat often enough." Sarah Coleman's voice came through the phone when Jake called her. "That's the nail in the coffin," she said. "I'll forward it to the district attorney tonight." Jake leaned back in his chair, eyes on the flickering monitor. "No," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Let her have one last night thinking she's still in control." The next day, dawn broke in pink and gray. From his porch, Jake watched the HOA sign across the road. Pine Creek Estates, a premier community, gleam faintly under dew. Then came the sirens. 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled up to Bethany's house. Deputies stepped out with quiet professionalism. No drama, no shouting. She emerged minutes later, dressed in her usual white blouse, hair immaculate, eyes blank. As they led her to the car, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Whitfield, any comment?" She hesitated, looking across the street toward Jake. "You'll ruin this neighborhood," she said softly. Jake met her gaze. "No," he said. "You already did." The car door shut. The engine started. The Queen of Pine Creek left her kingdom for the last time. By evening, the neighborhood was alive again. Not with fear, but with something that had been missing for too long. Conversation. People waved at one another. Kids rode bikes on the same sidewalks once patrolled by rule enforcers. Sarah sat beside Jake on the porch, her arm finally free of its sling. The light off the lake shimmered gold through the trellis vines. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he corrected. "And we did it by the book." Ernest pulled into the drive, a grin hiding behind his mustache. "You see the news? They're calling it the Pine Creek Purge. Not bad for a quiet town." Jake chuckled softly. "I prefer cleanup. Less dramatic." As dusk settled, the sound of frogs returned to the lake. For the first time in months, Pine Creek sounded like home again. But deep down, Jake knew it wasn't over. Justice was a process, not a moment. Tomorrow would bring hearings, court dates, paperwork, the slow grind of accountability. Still, for tonight, he allowed himself one rare thing: rest. The trellis swayed in the breeze, its flowers bright against the dark. He whispered to the quiet, "Justice doesn't shout." Morning light crept slow and golden across Pine Creek, spilling over fences and roofs that had once been watched, measured, and fined into submission. The air felt cleaner somehow, as if the whole valley had exhaled. Jake sat on the porch steps with his coffee cooling beside him, eyes fixed on the lake beyond the field. The mist was lifting, slow and soft, like a curtain drawing back after a long play. Sarah joined him, her shoulder healed, her movements easy again. "Feels strange," she said. "Quiet, but not the old kind, not the fearful kind." Jake nodded. That's what truth sounds like. The news had already traveled. Bethany's arrest made state headlines: embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction. Doug Peterson faced similar charges. Officer Benson had been stripped of his badge, pending trial for evidence tampering. Pine Creek wasn't a gated community anymore. It was a lesson. But peace wasn't something Jake trusted right away. Too many scars under the surface. Too many wounds pretending to be healed. He spent his mornings fixing the fence, his afternoons rebuilding the trellis, and his evenings teaching the neighborhood kids self-defense by the waterline. The laughter helped fill the hollow spaces the fight had left behind. One afternoon, as he hammered the last slat into place, Ernest Walker walked up the drive. His hat was pulled low, his boots crunching on gravel. "You get the letter yet?" Jake wiped sweat from his brow. "Letter?" "The court summons," Ernest said. "State's calling you in as the key witness next week. Judge Ramirez himself is presiding." Jake smiled faintly. "He's a fair man." "Fair and sharp," Ernest said. "You'll want to bring everything: dates, documents, the footage. They're lining this up to set precedent." That night, Jake gathered every file into neat stacks: the evidence binders, Sarah Coleman's legal summaries, Donald's recorded confession. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a record of how far control could go before it broke itself. When court day came, the town's old courthouse in Helena was crowded. The air smelled faintly of old wood polish and anxiety. Neighbors filled the benches, whispering softly until the bailiff called for order. Bethany sat at the defense table, no longer polished or proud. Her pearls were gone, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Doug avoided her gaze, his hands twisting a folded napkin into shreds. Judge Ramirez entered, his robe catching the morning light through the high windows. His voice carried a measured calm. "Let's begin." Jake took the stand first. His voice was steady, his story simple. No embellishments, no grand speeches, just facts. How it started with a trellis, how it grew into fines, threats, and manipulation. When the footage of 2:17 a.m. played across the courtroom screen, no one spoke. The image of Officer Benson planting the evidence was silent proof more powerful than any testimony. Sarah Coleman's closing statement tied everything together. Abuse of authority doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a smile and hides behind bylaws. But law, when used right, protects even from itself. When the verdict came, it was clean and final. Guilty on all counts. Restitution ordered to every homeowner. HOA dissolved. Assets liquidated to repay stolen dues. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Jake stepped into the sunlight, blinking at the sudden noise. Ernest clapped him on the back. "Well, son," he said, "looks like the good guys won one for a change." Jake gave a small smile. No winners, just survivors. They drove back to Pine Creek under a wide Montana sky, clouds like slow-moving ships overhead. When they reached the lake, neighbors were waiting. Families, kids, even Donald Snipe, now wearing a volunteer badge from the county's community outreach program. Sarah squeezed Jake's hand. "They're all here because you didn't give up." Jake looked around at the faces, people who had once avoided eye contact, now laughing, talking, living again. "Because we didn't," he said. He walked down to the trellis, now covered in blooming vines, and touched the cedar rail. The same wood that had started the war now stood as a monument to endurance. He carved a small inscription along the inner post. "Evidence beats violence." The sun dropped low, painting the lake in gold. Children's laughter echoed across the water, carried by wind that no longer sounded like warning. At the end of the path, a simple wooden gate led out to the open road. Its hinges creaked softly in the breeze. Jake pushed it open, the sound echoing faintly, steady, rhythmic, final. He turned back to Sarah, her hair catching the last light of evening. "You ever think we'd make it here?" She smiled. "You always said pressure makes diamonds. You just forgot how long it takes." He chuckled softly, slipping an arm around her shoulder. "Then maybe it's time we stopped measuring everything in battles." As they walked back toward the house, the porch light flicked on by itself, a motion sensor Jake had installed long before the trouble began. For the first time in months, he didn't check who might be watching. Behind them, the gate swung gently, the sound fading into the night. The echo lingered, a reminder that boundaries, once rebuilt on truth, didn't keep people out. They kept decency in. Spring came early that year. Pine Creek thawed under sunlight that glittered across the lake like scattered coins. The snowmelt fed the fields, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. Jake stood by the porch rail, coffee in hand, watching the vines climb higher along the trellis he'd built what felt like a lifetime ago. The wood had darkened, the cedar now streaked with weather and memory, but it still stood firm. Sarah's roses, once small and uncertain, had grown wild and free, spilling color into the morning air. From down the road came the sounds of laughter, children riding bikes, neighbors greeting one another. The HOA was gone, its power dissolved, replaced by a residents' council that met once a month in the old clubhouse. No fines, no threats, just discussions, coffee, and volunteer sign-up sheets. Donald Snipe now led the community center, his voice steady but humble. He'd served his sentence, then stayed to make things right. On Saturdays, he ran a youth program, teaching kids about accountability, teamwork, and second chances. Ernest helped him set up a small library inside the old enforcement office, rows of donated books where once there had been stacks of violation forms. Sarah returned to full-time work at the hospital, her shoulder fully healed. But she found a new calling, organizing weekend health clinics for the community. "If we can prevent a few emergencies," she said with that quiet conviction of hers, "we save more than time. We save trust." Jake, for his part, had no interest in leading anything. His satisfaction came from rebuilding, repairing fences, teaching woodworking to the neighborhood teens, helping folks draft better contracts for their homes so they'd never be bullied by fine print again. He still carried his old Navy calm, but the tension that once defined him had loosened. The lake reflected not just the sky, but something lighter in him, a man no longer at war. That afternoon, Sarah called from the porch. "You've got mail!" He walked up the path, wiping his hands on his jeans. She held out a thick envelope stamped with the county seal. Inside was a letter from Judge Ramirez, formal but warm. "Mr. Morrison, the Pine Creek case has inspired statewide reform for homeowners associations. New oversight, transparency laws, and whistleblower protections have been enacted. You were the catalyst. Your evidence and your restraint turned frustration into justice. The system owes you more than a thank you, but this letter will have to do for now." Jake read it twice before setting it down. "Justice doesn't shout," he said again, half to himself, "but sometimes it echoes." That evening, as the sun began to drop behind the pines, neighbors gathered for the first official Pine Creek community dinner. Long tables stretched down the main street, covered in homemade dishes, cornbread, smoked trout, casseroles, and pies. Someone had hung fairy lights between the trees, and for once the only rules were laughter and courtesy. Sarah took Jake's hand. "You ever think this place would feel like home again?" He looked around, Donald serving soup, Ernest telling stories, kids chasing fireflies under the fading light. "Not like this," he said. "Better." The music started, an old guitar, a harmonica, nothing fancy, but it filled the air with something true. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling the soft pull of evening settle into peace. Later, when the last lanterns flickered out, he walked down to the lake. The surface rippled faintly under the moonlight. His reflection looked older, sure, but content. The trellis by the porch framed the glow of the house behind him, vines curling like nature's handwriting. Slow, patient, unstoppable. Sarah joined him, slipping her arm through his. "You know," she said, "if you ever wanted to tell your story..." He smiled. "It's not about me. It's about what happens when people stop being afraid." They stood there in silence, listening to the night, the crickets, the distant laughter, the wind moving softly through the reeds. The same wind that had once carried tension now carried only calm. "Funny," Sarah said at last. "All this started because of a trellis." Jake chuckled low. "Guess it was never just wood and nails. It was a line they crossed, and one we rebuilt." The sky deepened into indigo. Fireflies danced along the shore like sparks of memory. The trellis swayed once more, its flowers nodding in the breeze, each petal catching a whisper of light. Jake breathed deep, the scent of roses and cedar mixing in the air. "Some fights choose you," he said softly. "But if you stand your ground with truth, sometimes you end up growing something worth keeping." The camera of the world might have panned out there. The lake, the porch light, the vines rising steady under the stars. And for the first time in too long, Everything in Pine Creek stood still in perfect, earned peace. If you've ever stood your ground for what's right, drop a simple yes in the comments, or type justice if you've had your own run-in with an HOA. Out here, land isn't just dirt, it's dignity. And sometimes the quiet fight is the one that changes everything. Stick around, hit subscribe, and join me for the next story where truth, grit, and a little bit of country law still mean something.